Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about mind over matter, and we're going to be going through a little presentation that really talks about how we often create a lot of suffering in our lives when it comes to the way that we think about things. And before I get any further, I want to introduce myself. My name is Katie Wittekind, and I have a master's in applied positive psychology. I've been working with employers for about 8 years on how to bring well-being to the workplace and be more productive at work, but also help facilitate, better lives for our employees. And this tends to be a question that a lot of people ask. How can I deal with so much stress? And there's definitely this feeling that there's just too much stress and there's no way I can have control over it. So we're going to talk about that and where we do have some control. So today, what we're going to be talking about really is what we call thinking traps. What they are, we're going to be able to learn how to identify them, and we're going to learn how to overcome them. So we have a picture here of a flat tire. This is an age-old sort of situation in which people would really assume that it's a very stressful event, right? And so I put this picture here to give a little bit of context about if all events really are as stressful as they might seem. So really, when it comes to stress and stressful events, there's something happening here that often we're not talking about. There's A, which is an action or an activity that occurred, plus there's B, which is actually a belief about that, and then C, the consequence. So going back to this image of the flat tire, we think about, okay, the action might be the flat tire, but if there's no belief about what that might mean, then that could change the consequence or the amount of stress that you have. So, for example, let's say you have nowhere to go necessarily. You just go out and you see that there's a flat tire. So it might be mildly annoying, but it's not going to make you late to work. Versus on a day where you're about to go to work and you believe, oh no, if I'm late again, I might get fired. Then that's going to dramatically change the consequence, right? So I want you to remember this concept of A, like an action, plus B, a belief, equals C, a consequence. So we're going to get back to this in a second. But I did want to first address some myths about stress. So there's one myth about stress that you just don't have any control over it. It's just the world happening to you. And while that might seem like the case in many situations, you walk out and there is a flat tire. You go out and there's a worldwide pandemic. There is that level of environmental stresses we may not be able to control. Although I would like to push back and say sometimes we can. And I'm going to give you an example. If you know standing in line at the bank causes you to become impatient and increases your stress, one thing you could do is alter your environment by doing all your banking online and not go stand at the bank on Friday afternoon, right? So if we bring awareness to what's causing us stress, sometimes we can make a change to that. I want to give you another story about how sometimes our beliefs can impact our stress. So there's this belief that things happen in the environment and there's nothing that we can do about the stress. So I'm going to share a story. Early on in my marriage, I noticed that when my husband came home from work, he was happy and I was happy to see him. We were deeply in love. It was a great relationship. But unfortunately, I found that every time he came home, I felt stressed. Well, that's odd. First, it took me becoming aware of the fact that I was becoming stressed every time he came home to start to dive into trying to figure out, well, why? Why is that the case? When I started thinking about it, I realized a lot of the times I would have gotten the kids from school, helping them with their homework, and I wouldn't have made dinner yet. And somewhere by watching too much Leave It to Beaver or something growing up, I got the belief that I should have dinner ready by the time my husband got home. And then when I identified that and I told him, he laughed. He was like, "That's ridiculous. I'm a much better cook anyway. Why don't you just let me do the dinner?" So it really is an example or an illustration that it's not always just the environment happening to us, that sometimes there's beliefs happening, or there's our ability to change the environment that happen. But the third part of the stress myth that I really want to address here, and this is really what the class is about, is that sometimes there are things like COVID-19 that occur in our lives that we can't necessarily control or change our environment to change. And it's not necessarily a belief that's going to change that base level of stress that we might experience. But our beliefs can cause what I call the second arrow, or essentially when we have our base level of stress from the environment we're having, and now our beliefs and fears have piled on top of that and created a second arrow of unneeded additional stress to the situation. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is really what those beliefs are, how do we identify them, and how do we overcome them. So if your beliefs are that you might lose your job because you're late because you have a flat tire, then your stress might be even higher than if it were just that, oh man, I'm going to have to spend the time to replace this flat tire. So what we're talking about are thinking traps. And thinking traps are essentially these beliefs that we're talking about. And we call them traps because you'll notice you'll start to ruminate. You'll get stuck in these ways of thinking, and it's hard to get out of them. I call them the prison you create for yourself. So let's go over some examples, some common examples of these thinking traps. One is catastrophizing. So this is where you think of the worst case possible scenario, and that's what you're focusing on. I'll give like a small example. A small example might be a friend is coming to visit you from another faraway town, and they're driving, and you call them and they don't answer their phone. And so you immediately assume they've gotten into a car accident. So that would be catastrophizing, by going based on very limited information and assuming the worst case scenario. So a good question to ask for this, to really challenge this thinking trap, is what is the most likely case scenario? If you can stop, become aware, oh my gosh, I'm thinking of the worst case scenario here, and ask yourself, what is the most likely case scenario? You have an opportunity to see your out of this little thinking trap. Now, you can see how worst case scenarios can create unneeded additional stress to a situation. But let's talk about all or nothing thinking. So you'll notice on this slide, I put a picture of math on the background. And I put that because you'll find that there's a lot of people who talk about math as being something they are either good at or not good at. There's no one you really hear say like, yeah, I'm kind of good at some math. And I am reminded of my oldest son who came home and he said, oh, I got a D on my math test. I suck at math. I'm just no good at it. I don't like it. And a good way to know if you're in a thinking trap is when your response really outweighs the situation, when your response seems bigger than the situation. That's a good way to identify if you're in a thinking trap. So my son comes home, he throws a fit, he throws his books, he screams at his brother, yells at me, and then he tells me he got a D on his math test. This is a good indication that he's definitely in a thinking trap. So a good question for all or nothing thinking is this question: is there evidence to the contrary? Is there any evidence to the contrary? So in this story, this example I shared with you, when I asked my son, well, is there any evidence to the contrary that you are not terrible at math? Well, I got a B in math last year. Oh, that's some significant evidence to the contrary. How about your last quiz? What was your last quiz? Oh, I got a B on my last quiz. Oh, so it was just this latest quiz in math that you got a D in. So you're now deciding that you're terrible at something based on one grade and one quiz, right? So that's the example of how these thinking traps work. as we're going through these, I want you to spend a second and really think and see if you can see yourself in these, or maybe someone you know, someone you live with, someone you love. And start to identify those moments when you might be stuck in a thinking trap. So we're going to go on to the next one, overgeneralization. So overgeneralization is when we make assumptions about our overall worth or ability on very limited information. I put an email in the background as a picture here to give an example where you might hear someone say, like, I sent out an invite to my party and no one has responded. Okay, is there any other possible explanation why someone might not have responded yet? Well, when did you send the email? 2 hours ago. Okay, well, maybe people haven't checked their email in 2 hours, and them not responding doesn't mean anything about your worth or ability, right? So a good question to ask about this thinking trap is there another possible explanation? Okay, so another one that is a really common one is externalizing. And I put a picture of a child in the background because this is actually a normal part of childhood development. They do this a lot. But I know when I describe this, you'll see some adults that you know in it as well. So externalizing is when you spend a lot of time blaming things outside of yourself for what's happening. So I gave a great example. When a child is running down the hallway and they're not looking where they're going, and they run right into a door and they yell, "Ow, the door hit me." That's a great example of externalizing, or essentially blaming something else. And this can really become a pretty extensive thinking trap, because once you start to see all things this way as an individual, it becomes really hard to get out of. A great question, just try to not only identify when you're in it, but try to get out of and overcome this thinking trap, is the question, is there another possible explanation? Is it possible that you weren't looking where you were going and you ran into the door? Now, while that may not be a very comfortable realization for that child or that adult in your life, it's a valuable one, because once they start to see their part in what's happening, they also can start to see their power. And that's a lot of why we're going over thinking traps. I know from a positive psychology perspective, it might seem weird, like, oh, we're going over all these negative ways of thinking, but there's no power if you can't identify them and overcome them to be able to change to a more positive approach. So there's just a few more here. And if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat box any questions you might have. So another one is personalizing. And I have a great picture in the background here. You can see a man and a woman, and the woman is obviously what I would call perturbed. And this happens a lot. And a good example of this is really when someone takes all the blame for the circumstance. And I'm going to tell you a little story. So imagine, we'll call him John and we'll call her Sue, okay? So John's at home. Sue comes home. She's had a rough day. She's tired. John says, "Hey, babe, what's the matter?" Sue says, "Nothing. I'm just tired. It was a rough day." "Okay, well, I can clearly see that you're not okay. Did I do something wrong?" No, John, it's fine. I've just had a rough day." Okay, so Sue sits down, she's trying to relax. He's looking at her. He goes, "Are you mad at me because I didn't pick up the dry cleaning?" And then she looks at him and goes, "I'm mad at you now." So this is not an uncommon circumstance. Usually when I tell this story, I see several people laughing because they can identify with this circumstance. It's personalizing. It's believing that, all things that are happening, you're the person to blame for it. And a good question for this is it possible this isn't about me? Is it possible that Sue genuinely is just tired and had a rough day and not mad at him about the dry cleaning or anything else, and only becomes mad at him when he keeps pestering her about how it's about him, right? So a good question is it possible this isn't about me? And then another great one, mind reading. So this is something that I find a lot of adults do a lot of the time. And it goes in multiple ways. So you see a picture in the background. You can see a woman that seems obviously irritated and a man who seems to be ignoring her typing on his computer. And it's really this process of thinking that you know what someone else is thinking, or assuming that they should know what you're thinking. And a good example of this, and if you know of anyone who has children, this is a great example. Oftentimes you'll see an adult in the room, and then kids will come in and they'll be like loud and, you know, rolling around or play fighting or something. And you can see at least one adult starting to get more and more irritated. And you can just tell they're really uncomfortable by the sound and the noise. And then all of a sudden they just go, "Can you shut up?" And they like lose it, right? Well, the thing is that whole 5 minutes before they lost it, they never actually said out loud what it is they were wanting. So a good question to ask is, did I state what I wanted or ask what they wanted? So if you're assuming that you can read what someone else is thinking, let's give an example of like you come to work and your boss seems upset and now you're thinking, oh man, you know, he's totally upset because of the report I turned in last week and the mistakes that I made. But you know, you're reading his mind and maybe that's not what he's upset at all. So did you ask what they wanted or what was going on? Or did you state what it is you wanted? Did you say, hey kids, can you quiet down please? So this is a great way to address some of these thinking traps. And remember, when we talked about, oh, one more thinking trap actually. Let's talk about this one first before I move on. Jumping to conclusions. So in the background, you'll see a picture of a text message and it says, "Are you there? What's going on? Are we breaking up?" So this is where you jump to conclusions on limited information. So it might not be catastrophizing. You might not be thinking of the worst case possible scenario. Catastrophizing in the situation might be assuming that they've died, right? But this is like, because they haven't responded to your text message, you're jumping to conclusion that you're breaking up, right? And you know, maybe it's been a few hours in between, or maybe they're taking a nap, or maybe they're taking a shower, maybe they got called into a second shift at work. Who knows why they're not responding? But you really are jumping to conclusion with very limited information. And you can see how these thinking traps can really add additional levels of stress where maybe they're not needed. There's plenty of things that we can't control for us to choose to feel stressed about without adding on what I call the second arrow, or these levels of stress based on these thinking traps. So a good question for this one is, what is the most likely case scenario? Well, it's only been a few hours. Most likely case scenario, you just got caught up in doing something, and it doesn't have to do with our relationship necessarily. So with all of these, I'd like you to recall that, I would like you to recall the equation that we had up on the screen earlier, which was A plus B equals C. Remember, an action or an event of some sort plus your beliefs equals the consequence. And the thing is you might not have control over the flat tire or the COVID-19 or the breakup or whatever, but you do have control over the consequence to a certain extent via your beliefs, which are sandwiched in the middle. So these thinking traps are a way for you to help identify where you might be adding a second arrow or a second level of stress where there may not be need for one. So your homework for tonight is to try to role play this. If you live alone and you want to role play it with a cat, that's fine. Call a friend, talk it through with them. But think of a common situation as we've gone through all these thinking traps. I'd like you to think of one that resonates most with you and a situation that you can identify with, and then talk it out role play it, but stop it right when you identify where you normally would head right into that thinking trap. Ask yourself the question, whether it be, what is the most likely case scenario? Or, is there any evidence to the contrary? And then see if you can allow that to dissolve a bit. Now, I will say oftentimes it's easier to identify thinking traps in people around us before we identify it in ourselves. But I highly recommend you do some role play with this, because that's how we start to remap our response to certain circumstances. So again, today we were talking about thinking traps. We were talking about what they are. And so hopefully now at the end of this, you understand that thinking traps are belief systems that are based on minimal information typically, that often lead to higher levels of stress where it's not needed. You now know how to identify a thinking trap. And remember that you can identify it when you see a reaction to a circumstance or situation that seems far outweighing the actual circumstance. It's one thing to be slightly perturbed that you have a flat tire. It's quite another to throw your bag on the ground and start crying and yelling and putting your fists in the air, right? That would be a good indication you might be stuck in a thinking trap. And then hopefully now you understand how to overcome a thinking trap by asking yourself some of those questions. And those main questions tend to be, what's the most likely case scenario? Is there any evidence to the contrary? What's most likely, right? So hopefully this empowers you to start finding your way out of your own mental prison with your thoughts and beginning to open the doors for different ways of empowering yourself with your circumstances and your consequence. So I just would like to say thank you for joining me today, and be sure to do your homework and find someone to role play with. And I wish you well during all of our uncertain times, and may you have no more second arrows adding unneeded additional stress. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to post questions in the comment box or the chat box. I see lots of thank yous. One, thank you so much. You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here. And I'm here definitely to answer any questions. If I can figure out a way to post a flyer, I do have a flyer of all the thinking traps and the questions that go along with them. So I will find a way to try to post that as well. I see a good question here. What is another example of an adult externalizing? Yeah, so I guess I can think of a few different examples. And this one might be a little too familiar for some, but it's this idea that you talk to somebody and they say, oh, I just recently got divorced. And I say, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And then they proceed to tell you how the divorce was all the other person's fault, right? It was everything about them. It was all their fault. And they're spending all of their energy externalizing that everything was this other person to blame. The reality that we know when it comes to relationships is no matter how much we like to admit it or not, we all take a part in some of those aspects. Now, while some person may have done a lot of really obvious things that brought the relationship to an end, that doesn't mean we don't all have a piece to it that we can all take responsibility for. So that might be an example where I commonly see adult externalizing. Are there any other questions? Okay. Will this be shareable for our community? Yeah, this webinar is being recorded, and then I'm told I will be given a link to share, and then I'm able to share that. Absolutely, Crystal, with the MAPP employee group, yes. Okay. I know we went through it a little bit fast, but it's late on a Monday, so I didn't want to take too much of your time. Again, I will do my best to try to post the flyer. I have a question. Did you go on an hour earlier? No, I was told to start the talk at 5, but unfortunately I had a little tech issues and it didn't get started until about 6 or 7 minutes after the hour. And I was told to provide a 30-minute presentation with about 15 minutes for questions. So I ended at 5:30, but if there was any sort of time zone issues, I can be sure that they got the full recording, and if not, I can always record it again if some pieces were missing. Oh, looks like we have some more questions. Online, it says the time started was 5:30. Could you send out the full recording to all? Oh, I see. Okay, so maybe the time that got started was not presented correctly, or maybe I was misunderstanding. I'm in New Zealand and got the right time. Okay, so maybe there was some misunderstanding on all accounts on the time. Yes, I will be sure to send out the recording to all people who registered for it. I'm so sorry that you started it after I'd already begun. Yeah. I hear an awesome thank you. We all need this and I want to share it. Great. I'm happy to provide the recording to your employee group. Another question is, what is a way that I can prevent myself from personalizing when, for example, I have an interview for a scholarship I want, but don't end up getting it? I tend to really blame myself afterwards. Oh man, yeah, I mean, we all have a tendency to go there. I think the trick when it comes to thinking traps is to recognize that you don't have to stay stuck in the thought. You can also forgive yourself for having the thought in the first place. It's okay to sit there and think, oh, it's my fault I didn't get it. But at the same time, it's okay to realize, hey, is it possible there's any other evidence or reasons why that might not have been given to me? You know, it's possible that someone had a greater need and the same level of experience and qualifications, right? So it's this it's this way of getting out of the thinking trap. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to have the thought, but it means you don't have to stay stuck in it, right? So that would be a great way to just identify, ask yourself the question, and hopefully give yourself a way out. Also, ask for feedback from the interview. Yeah, that's a great comment for the last question. If you have an interview and you don't get it, it's a great thing to ask for feedback so that you have an opportunity to improve. And then I see Mind Over Matter webinar 5:30. Okay, yep. So it looks like I was told 5, someone else was told 5:30. It was presented in another time zone at 5, or at this time that I started it. So I'm really sorry for the confusion, but I will ensure that the recording gets sent out. Here we go. Here's another question. Can the solution of asking myself, is there any evidence to the contrary, something that can help me with all the listed thinking traps? You know, I've explored this and I think it just depends. I think it's easier to think of just one question, and the all or nothing thinking, the catastrophizing, the jumping to conclusions, these are all great ways. And I think that one question can be helpful. The only reason why I offer the other questions is sometimes some questions resonate more with other types of people. But if you find that that works for all of them for you, have at it. You certainly don't. It's not like a scientific outcome where you have to ask this question to get out of the thinking trap. You know, it's really, the powerful piece of it is developing the habit and of being mindful when noticing how you're feeling and when you're adding additional levels of stress. And then at that moment of awareness, you can ask yourself a question. You've done an amazing thing. So yeah, I do think, is there any evidence to the contrary, is a really reasonable question that you could potentially ask in all situations. The only challenge is when you don't have any evidence to the contrary, or sometimes people have evidence that supports their belief, and that's why other questions can be helpful. For example, if I had asked someone who likes to personalize a lot, well, is there any evidence to the contrary that you're not to blame for this? They would say, well, no, because this happened and this happened and this, and they would come up with lots of evidence why they're to blame, right? So that's why that question can be tricky depending on what it is, what thinking trap you're dealing with and the personality type. Okay, I feel like you're giving me tools I have needed throughout my adulthood. Thank you. Oh, you're so welcome. That's why I really value. It's a simple tool and a powerful one. Indeed, I've definitely found it to be useful personally and professionally. Let's see if we have any more questions in the Q&A section. I don't see any. You are all very welcome. Again, I will ensure that they send out the live recording to everyone who signed up for this class. Sorry about the confusion for start time. And I really wish you all a wonderful evening and awareness and mindfulness on those thinking traps so that you can see your way out. Have a wonderful night and thank you for being here. Take care.